All right, welcome. The next book we're going to be reading in class, well, I should say reading, watching, performing, listening to, um, is Shakespeare's incredibly awesome, violent, at times really funny, at times incredibly sad and emotional play, Macbeth. Um, we're going to be working with this text over the next marking period. So I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of background information about the playwright, some of which you might already know. Some of this information might be new. Um, Regardless, I strongly suggest that you take notes. Not only will that be helpful for you moving forward, but um, we may or may not, and by that I mean we will have a short quiz on this presentation in class tomorrow, and your notes may prove helpful for that. So definitely take notes. All right, on to the first slide. Okay, so Shakespeare was writing during a historical time period, which you've ideally learned about in history class, known as the Renaissance. Um, and Renaissance theater, um, obviously Shakespeare being maybe the most famous author from that time period, had a few influence on it had a few influences on it that are worth talking about, so that we can see where Shakespeare came from. He didn't just suddenly emerge and appear and write all these amazing plays and then, you know, die so we can read them 400 years later. There are some pretty big influences on his life and on his writing style that are important for understanding his plays. The first major influence on Shakespeare and anyone else that was writing during the Renaissance was medieval drama, and these were the kinds of plays that were going on for hundreds of years before Shakespeare and his colleagues came along during the Renaissance. Um, and the thing that you need to know about medieval drama is that it was not very complex. You didn't really go see a medieval drama production for the great characters, the plot twists, the well developed plots. Plots were really basic. Either they were based on stories from the Bible, these things called cycles, they were based on the saints and their lives, which were usually short and violent and did not end well. Or there were these things called morality tales, which were these incredibly simplistic, be a good person because if you don't, bad things will happen and you will go to hell. So, yeah, not very engaging stuff. However, people would flock to these plays not only because it's the Middle Ages and there's not much else to do besides get the plague and die, um, but these productions were so violent and bloody, and people, for some reason, are drawn to the violent and the bloody and the macabre. Um, not that that happens today. So that was medieval drama, a huge influence on Shakespeare. Oh, here are some just images, Renaissance drama, what this looked like. These are some characters that might have been featured in a morality play. And this is what a theater, quote unquote, looked like. It was mobile. People just kind of gathered in a town center to watch. And then the acting troupe would pack up and move to the next town. So there was no permanent theater. So the second influence on Shakespeare and Renaissance drama as a whole was this thing called classical drama. So while most of the people in England are going to see the religious plays, the morality plays, the medieval stuff, in the universities, the students there are performing and learning about some very different kinds of plays. They're learning about the Greek and Roman dramatists, people like Sophocles, Euripides. If you end up taking Miss Dickstein's class next year, you'll read a bunch of these writers. It's really good stuff. The plays, these kinds of plays, obviously they're reading them in the original Greek, the original Latin, but the characters are complex, the plots are interesting, They're very deep, kind of opposite to the medieval drama that's going on for the common people. But the thing to remember about classical drama in the years leading up to Shakespeare is these were only really being performed and watched within universities, and universities were for the very elite, the priests, the upper class, ruling class people. No one else is really seeing these. So, really important guy named Thomas Kyd comes along, towards the end, middle to end of the 1500s. And the reason that Thomas Kyd is so important is because he takes some ideas from medieval drama. Specifically, he takes the violence that people loved so much, and he combines them with some of the best ideas from the classical playwrights that's going on in the universities, such as interesting plots, well-developed, well-rounded characters, things like that. So he ends up writing this play called The Spanish Tragedy, and it's a huge hit. It's a revenge tragedy. The characters are relatable. The the play is incredibly violent. It used to be in the classical drama. If there ever was violence, it always happened off stage. So if there was a fight, if there was self-mutilation, something like that, always happened off stage. Thomas Kyd brings the violence on stage, sword fights, people getting stabbed, fake blood flying all over the place. People love it, and who can blame them? He also writes in this thing called the iambic pentameter. It's a verse form that sounds pretty natural to human speech, hence why so many writers in that time period use it. And Thomas Kyd just revolutionizes the English theater scene and the way people write, the kinds of plays people go to see, and is maybe the single most important influence on Shakespeare. So don't forget Thomas Kyd. Okay, so don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but something interesting about being a professional actor in Shakespeare's time. For a long time, in the years and even centuries leading up to Shakespeare's time, basically actors were people who didn't have jobs, didn't really have a purpose in life, because if they got caught just hanging around not doing anything, they could actually get put in jail. They could get forced into the military. So they decided to become actors and find patrons, these wealthy individuals who would sponsor them to put on plays. That way they were working, kind of. They weren't making very much money, if any money, but at least they wouldn't get forced into the military. But by the time we get to Shakespeare, we still have these things called patrons, these noblemen who pay actors to put on shows. It's just a sign of being wealthy, essentially, if you can afford to have your own acting troupe. And Shakespeare's, his most famous patron was Lord Chamberlain, so his acting troupe was originally known as Lord Chamberlain's Men. Later, once they become really famous and popular, the king actually adopts them as their patron. They become the King's Men. But this is the first time in the modern theater scene that by the time we get to Shakespeare, that we have professional actors. So those vagrancy laws eventually get repealed, and people become actors because they want to be actors. They want to get paid, not just because they want to avoid getting arrested or being forced into the military. So kind of interesting note about that. Here's what we know about Shakespeare, his very, very early life. It's actually not that much. And a lot of this is guesswork because records were not, especially for someone born into a middle-class family, which Shakespeare was, records are not great from 400 years ago. But what we do know about Shakespeare is that he did not receive a college education. His father, as far as we can guess, was probably a local government official. And we think that because his father may have had the job of essentially screening or previewing some of the acting troupes that would travel from town to town to make sure that the play they were putting on was morally acceptable, whatever. And we think that that's the way Shakespeare first got introduced to the theater, is that his father would take him along to watch these test performances, and that maybe that's how Shakespeare became interested in becoming a playwright. Possibility. We know that he marries a woman named Anne Hathaway, yes, like the annoying actress from God knows what, Dark Knight Rises and The Les Mis. This Anne Hathaway had the name first, 1582. A little bit of an age difference. Anne Hathaway, kind of a cougar, just saying. And they have several children. Susanna is born in 1583, and then they have twins in 1585. And then sometime after that, Shakespeare moves to London, because that's where, if you want to be a writer and if you want to be a playwright, you want to be an actor, that's where you have to go. Almost like you have to go to New York or Hollywood these days to make it. So most of the time, back in the late 1500s, plays were written by committee, which means that a bunch of people sat around and wrote the plays together. It wasn't just one person. Shakespeare is different. Everyone kind of recognized, all right, this guy's pretty good. He can write his own plays. He still acted in his own plays, though. So usually not the main role, but that's okay. He was more of a writer than an actor. Plays would usually run 1 to 2 weeks. Audiences always needed new plays coming in. They get bored easily, kind of like how we every week have brand new movies opening. There's like one blockbuster after another. Think about the summertime, or even now, like James Bond opened, and then Hunger Games is opening, then Star Wars. It's just one big movie after another because we get bored. And he wrote some great comedies, great tragedies. That's the basic time frame for those. A little bit more about Shakespeare. When he first moved to London, this was before he established himself. He was not especially well liked. There was actually a playwright named Robert Greene who called him an upstart crow beautified with our feathers. So a little bit of a jealousy streak there with Robert Greene, but Shakespeare was kind of a hack at first. His first couple plays actually aren't that great, not gonna lie, but he hit his stride eventually. Plus, he was from a low birth, right? So he was middle class, never had a college education. He might have been looked down upon because of that. He did purchase a coat of arms towards the late 1590s, which is something you could do. So kind of a social mobility thing. His coat of arms were a little bit of a social status. In 1599, the Globe Theatre is built. A little bit more about that in a second. This is an important date, 1603. Because this is when Queen Elizabeth dies, and this is a huge event in English history. She was such a dynamic, powerful, consistent ruler for so many years that when she died, there was a lot of anxiety about where the country was headed, what's going to happen, who's going to take over. They weren't even sure about that at first. So that's a date I'm going to come back to in a second, because Shakespeare wrote Macbeth just as the year after Queen Elizabeth died, and the new king was taking the throne, James I. He gets his sons published after that, eventually returns home to Stratford, his hometown, dies in 1616, and his works don't get published until after his death. So publication was not a huge deal back then. It was more about the performances, so keep that in mind. Here's a diagram of the Globe Theatre. So if you think back to those first couple slides I showed you of the medieval theater, how it was that mobile stage they would just break down and carry from one town to another, well, that's gone now. We have these very permanent, surprisingly large established theaters that were super popular. They were self-sufficient, they financed themselves. The Globe is possibly the most well-known. There's actually a recreation of it in London if you go get a chance to see Shakespeare as it was originally performed, which is kind of cool. But you notice it's obviously a circular structure. If you can see this area right here where this arrow is pointing to kind of like the mosh pit area of the Globe, that's where the people called the groundlings would watch the show. And the groundlings were kind of lower class people who would show up to the show, usually drunk. Usually you'd have to break up some fights. They'd all be kind of gathered here hence the ground, on the groundlings. They'd be gathered here in front of the stage, and Shakespeare would have to make sure that he included a bunch of just like sex jokes, things like that, things that the groundlings are going to find hilarious, as well as his, deep philosophical speeches and stuff like that. The stage was elevated about 5 feet, over 5 feet actually. Part of the reason was to keep the groundlings from getting too close to climbing on the stage, make it a little bit more difficult for them in their drunken stupors. Plus, there was a trapdoor that they would use for, pretty rudimentary special effects, so you need some space for that. There were some props, not too many. Costumes were not period. In other words, the costumes they wore were of the 1590s, the early 1600s, not of, like, let's say, Antony and Cleopatra. They weren't wearing, historically accurate costumes from the Roman Empire. And then if they wanted to recreate the night sky, they had a canopy that they could drag over the stage. So, kind of cool stuff. That's the globe. All right, just a couple more slides here. Some important information about the play itself, Macbeth. So, the story takes place well before Shakespeare's time. It actually takes place, the roots of the story go back to the 800s AD. So, for hundreds of years, there were these kind of ongoing wars between the Vikings and the people of the British Islands. The Vikings would invade, conquer, rape, pillage, horrible, horrible things. And for a long time, the people of the British Isles were just trying to survive, trying to fight back, trying to do anything that they could. Macbeth opens in the year 1040, and it takes place in Scotland. And at the very beginning of the play, we're going to be thrown into, we'll see. But we're going to find out what is happening in the very last battle between the Scottish people and the Vikings, who were trying to, like they've been trying to for hundreds of years, invade, take over. But there's going to be this battle going on. Scotland is victorious, and the Vikings retreat. They surrender. Oh, by the way, the Vikings were also hiring Irish mercenaries, so there'll be some references to that. And there'll be some reference also in the first couple scenes to traitors, so Scottish soldiers who went over to the other side and were fighting for the Vikings and the Irish. In particular, there's one named MacDonald. So in addition to making delicious hamburgers at a reasonable price, MacDonald was also a traitor against the Scottish people. Wow. King Duncan the First, incredibly important character in the play, is King of Scotland at this time. Interesting name, interesting bit of trivia about Shakespeare. He didn't really invent any of his plots. He just kind of stole them from other people. So the plot from Macbeth, he stole from this guy named Holinshead. That's how it's pronounced. It's British pronunciation, I guess. The S. Anyway. Who wrote A History of Britain. Shakespeare just essentially took the story of Macbeth right from Holinshead. So that's where the story came from. The play is written not too long after the death of Elizabeth I. 1606 is when it first gets produced. And much of the play is a tribute to the new King of England, James I. James I was Scottish. So there'll be several instances in this play where Shakespeare's almost doing a direct shout out to James I. Oh, and by the way, the first public performance of Macbeth was a private audience for James. So Shakespeare knew that was his audience. He knew that James I was going to be watching this. So he did some things intentionally that James the First would like. Like James the First hated the real Macbeth, so Shakespeare turns him into kind of a villain, or maybe just an anti-hero. We'll talk about that. James was also paranoid. The previous year in 1605, there was an attempted terrorist attack on the Parliament building, known as the Gunpowder Plot. There was a guy named Guy Fawkes, appropriate, who was part of a Catholic underground movement. They wanted England to become Catholic again, so they tried to blow up the building. The bombs didn't go off, the gunpowder didn't go off, but it made James the First really, really paranoid. He was already paranoid, and then he became super paranoid after Guy Fawkes tried to blow up Parliament, which, by the way, is the V for Vendetta. Remember the 5th of November. That's where that comes from. Anyway, so James the First, he's paranoid. He's obsessed with the paranormal. So there's a lot of paranormal activity, and not the annoying movies that they release a new one of every single year. The shaky cam found footage getting super annoying. It's not that, but there are instances of, well, we'll see. He does make some changes, though, like King Duncan in the original history was an old guy, was a young guy. Shakespeare makes him older for reasons that we'll talk about. And then Duncan in real life had a very young son who was 9, and in the play, Shakespeare makes him older for reasons that we will talk about, or that might even be obvious as we go through the play together. And then this is the last slide. Some terms that some of which you may be familiar with, others you may not. A word we're going to see come up over and over and over again is this word thane, which is it's a title for a Scottish nobleman. So it'll be like the thane of so-and-so. And it has medieval roots, but that's Shakespeare trying to be historically accurate. So we'll see that word thane come up. A soliloquy, which you hopefully have learned about already. That's when there's an actor speaking alone on stage, and it's basically a way for Shakespeare to show us, hey, this is what this character is thinking, because it's not a book. I can't just show you exactly what's going on inside this person's head. So they're going to have to speak it out loud, which may seem weird, but it's how you have to do things on stage. An aside is like a mini soliloquy in some ways. It's usually really brief, really short. It's made to the audience or to the character himself. Other characters on stage can't hear it, so it's like almost like a mini soliloquy. And then last but not least, we'll see this thing called a paradox. Again, you might know what that means, but that's a statement that has two contradictory ideas at once, and yet even though it has these two contradictory ideas, may actually be true in some ways. So Act 1, Scene 1 is like a page long, but almost every single line in it is a paradox, and we're going to look at those and talk about them. So please be aware of those things. And that's it. That's it for my presentation. Thank you for your patience. Make sure that you have taken good notes if you haven't, because that's going to be very, very helpful for you. I look forward to reading, performing, listening to, watching Macbeth with you guys. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and I hope you enjoy it. All right, I'll see you guys in class tomorrow. Bye.